August 15th, 1945, Yokohama Naval Hospital, Japan. The cicadas screamed in the late summer heat. Inside the gray concrete walls of Yokohama Naval Hospital, the air hung thick with disinfectant, sweat, and something else, something unnameable. Nurse Kimiko Hayashi moved silently down the corridor, her white uniform crisp despite the oppressive humidity. Her wooden sandals made no sound against the polished floor. She carried a tray of folded gauze squares, each one prepared with the precision her training demanded. Outside, through the narrow windows, she could see the ruins of the city stretching toward the harbor. Blackened skeletons of buildings, twisted metal, ash-covered streets where children once played. The war was over. Emperor Hirohito's voice had crackled through the radio just hours earlier, speaking in formal court language that most citizens struggled to comprehend. But the meaning was clear enough. Japan had surrendered. The divine empire had fallen. For 24-year-old Kimiko, the announcement brought not relief, but a cold, creeping dread. She had heard the stories whispered among the other nurses, stories of what conquering soldiers did to the women of defeated nations. Stories from Nanking, from Manila, from Berlin. The military command had distributed cyanide capsules to female staff members 3 days earlier. Kimiko kept hers in the pocket of her uniform, a small glass vial that clicked softly against her thigh with each step. She did not know that within 72 hours, American soldiers would be walking these same corridors. She did not know that one of them, a lanky private from Nebraska named Thomas Hartley, would sit beside her in the staff room and ask her, in broken, earnest Japanese, to teach him how to fold a paper crane. She could not have imagined that this simple request would shake the foundations of everything she had been taught to believe about the enemy. The propaganda had been absolute. For years, the Japanese people had been told that American soldiers were devils incarnate, savage beasts who would rape, pillage, and destroy without mercy. The government-controlled newspapers had shown photographs of burned villages in the Pacific, of crucified prisoners, of women's bodies discarded like refuse. Radio broadcasts described Americans as subhuman monsters driven by bloodlust and racial hatred. School children were taught that death was preferable to capture. Honor demanded it. The Bushido Code demanded it. And now they were coming. August 18, 1945. The first Americans arrived at Yokohama Naval Hospital in the early morning. Kimiko watched from the second-floor window as olive-green trucks rumbled through the gates, their engines growling like mechanical beasts. Her hands trembled. Several nurses had fled during the night, choosing to return to their families rather than face what they believed would be certain violation and death. Those who remained, 37 women in total, had gathered in the supervisor's office at dawn. Matron Oshiro, a stern woman of 50 with gray streaking her tightly bound hair, had addressed them with the rigid composure expected of military personnel. "You will conduct yourselves with dignity," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. "You will maintain our honor. Whatever comes, we are daughters of Nippon. We do not break." Kimiko noticed that Matron Oshiro's hand rested in her pocket, where her own cyanide capsule surely waited. The Americans entered the building with medical supplies stacked on stretchers. There were 12 of them initially, doctors, medics, and administrative personnel assigned to assess the hospital's condition and determine what resources the wounded Japanese soldiers would need during the occupation. They wore clean uniforms that smelled of soap and laundry starch. They moved with purpose, but not aggression. Their boots echoed heavily in the corridor. Kimiko pressed herself against the wall, head bowed, eyes fixed on the floor. Every muscle in her body was tensed for violence. She waited for rough hands, for shouted commands, for the nightmare to begin. Instead, an American medical officer approached Matron Oshiro and, through a Japanese-American interpreter, asked permission to inspect the pharmacy. Permission. The word hung in the air like something foreign and incomprehensible. Conquerors did not ask permission. The inspection took 3 hours. The Americans moved through the hospital methodically, taking notes, examining equipment, speaking in low voices. They brought in crates marked with red crosses. Inside were bottles of plasma, morphine, sulfa drugs, bandages, surgical instruments, supplies that Japan had not seen in adequate quantities for over 2 years. One of the American doctors, a captain with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, paused beside a Japanese soldier whose leg had been amputated below the knee. The wound was infected, the flesh angry and swollen. Through the interpreter, the captain asked Kimiko to assist him. Her hands shook as she held the tray of instruments. The American doctor worked with steady, practiced movements. He debrided the wound, applied sulfa powder, administered penicillin, a drug Kimiko had only heard about in whispers, a miracle medicine the Americans possessed in abundance. When he finished, he placed a gentle hand on the Japanese soldier's shoulder and spoke softly. The interpreter translated, "You're going to be okay, son. We'll take good care of you." The Japanese soldier, a 19-year-old named Takeshi, who had lost his leg at Okinawa, stared at the American doctor with an expression of profound confusion. Then slowly, tears began to stream down his face. Not from pain, but from something else entirely. Something that none of them had words for yet. By evening, the Americans had set up a command post in the hospital's administrative wing. They brought in field kitchens and prepared hot meals for the patients and staff. The smell of cooking meat drifted through the building. Real meat, not the dried fish and watery miso soup that had sustained them for months. An American sergeant distributed rations to the Japanese nurses, handing each woman a small cardboard box with a smile and a nod. Kimiko accepted hers with both hands, bowing deeply out of habit and uncertainty. Inside the box, canned beef stew, crackers, chocolate, cigarettes, instant coffee, and chewing gum. The abundance was staggering. This was a single meal ration, and it contained more calories and variety than Kimiko had seen in a week. She held the chocolate bar, a Hershey's bar with brown paper wrapping, and felt something crack inside her chest. Not hunger, though she was desperately hungry. Something deeper, a fissure in the edifice of everything she had believed. If Americans were monsters, why were they feeding their enemies? August 20th, 1945. Private Thomas Hartley had grown up on a farm outside Grand Island, Nebraska. He was 22 years old, tall and thin, with sandy hair and the kind of open, friendly face that made people trust him instinctively. He had been drafted in 1943, trained as a medical corpsman, and spent 8 months in the Philippines treating casualties from the jungle campaigns. He had seen terrible things, bodies shredded by artillery, men burning alive from flamethrowers, the slow agony of tropical diseases. He had also seen how Japanese soldiers fought, how they preferred death to surrender, how they sometimes used wounded men as bait for booby traps. Thomas did not hate the Japanese. He found that he could not hate people he had never met, whose language he did not speak, whose lives and motivations remained mysterious to him. His mother had taught him that hatred was a poison that damaged the vessel that held it. His father, a veteran of the First World War, had told him that soldiers everywhere were mostly just scared young men trying to survive. When Thomas arrived at Yokohama Naval Hospital, he was struck by the fear in the eyes of the Japanese nurses. They moved like shadows, silent and vigilant, always keeping distance between themselves and the American personnel. He understood why. He had heard what Japanese civilians had been told about American soldiers, the same kinds of monstrous propaganda that Americans had been fed about the Japanese. Lies designed to make killing easier, to make surrender unthinkable. He wanted to bridge that gap somehow, to show through small actions that he meant no harm. But how? He spoke perhaps 20 words of Japanese, most of them medical terms he had picked up from the interpreter. The nurses spoke almost no English. They existed in parallel worlds within the same building, separated by an ocean of fear and misunderstanding. On his third day at the hospital, during a rare afternoon break, Thomas sat in the staff room attempting to write a letter home. The room was small and plain, with wooden benches along the walls and a low table in the center. A Japanese nurse sat at the far end of the room, as far from him as the space allowed. She was young, with delicate features and dark eyes that reminded him of a deer, always alert, always ready to flee. On the table in front of her was a small square of white paper. As Thomas watched, she began to fold it with precise, deliberate movements. Her fingers moved quickly, creasing and tucking, transforming the flat square into something three-dimensional. Within minutes, she had created a tiny bird with outstretched wings. Thomas was mesmerized. He had never seen anything like it. The transformation of something so simple into something so beautiful struck him as almost magical. Alchemy performed with nothing but paper and patience. He stood slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements, and approached the table. The nurse's hands froze. Her entire body went rigid. Thomas could see the fear flooding back into her eyes. He pointed to the paper bird and smiled. "That's real pretty," he said softly, knowing she would not understand the words, but hoping his tone would convey admiration rather than threat. The nurse said nothing. She stared at him with the wide-eyed terror of a trapped animal. Thomas sat down at the opposite end of the table, maintaining as much distance as the small room allowed. He took a piece of paper from his pocket, a page torn from his notebook, and placed it on the table. Then he pointed to her paper crane, then to his blank page, then to her again. He made a folding motion with his hands, clumsy and exaggerated, like a child playing charades. The nurse remained frozen for a long moment. Then, slowly, understanding dawned on her face. The American soldier was asking her to teach him origami. This was Kimiko Hayashi. And in that moment, her entire understanding of the world tilted on its axis. She had expected violence. She had expected degradation and death. She had carried a cyanide capsule in her pocket for 5 days, prepared to choose honorable death over American captivity. And now, this tall, gentle-faced enemy soldier was sitting across from her, asking her to teach him a children's craft. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Monsters did not ask to learn. Beasts did not admire beauty. Savages did not sit patiently with open, expectant expressions, waiting to be taught. Kimiko's hand moved to her pocket, where the glass vial rested. She felt its weight, its cold certainty. Then, slowly, she withdrew her hand. Empty. She picked up a fresh square of paper and began to fold. Her movements slow and deliberate, so that the American could follow. She did not look at his face. She could not, but she showed him how to make the first fold, creasing the paper diagonally, and then she waited. Thomas Hartley followed her example, his large, work-roughened hands fumbling with the delicate paper. He made the fold clumsily, the edges not quite aligned. He looked up at Kimiko with a sheepish grin and shrugged, a universal gesture of good-natured incompetence. Despite herself, despite everything, Kimiko felt the corners of her mouth twitch. Not quite a smile, but something close. She took his paper, unfolded it gently, and showed him again. More slowly this time, emphasizing the precise alignment of corners. They sat together for 45 minutes, speaking no common language, bridging the chasm of war with nothing but folded paper. By the end, Thomas had produced a lopsided crane that barely resembled its intended form. He held it up proudly anyway, and Kimiko allowed herself that small, suppressed smile. When the session ended and Thomas stood to leave, he bowed, a gesture he had practiced after watching Japanese civilians. The bow was clumsy, too deep and too stiff, but the intention was clear. Respect. Gratitude. Kimiko bowed in return, deeper and more practiced. And as the American soldier left the room, she sat alone with her paper cranes and felt tears streaming down her face. She did not know why she was crying. Relief, perhaps, or shame, or the terrible, painful dissolution of hatred. That evening, she removed the cyanide capsule from her pocket and placed it in the back of her locker. She would not need it, after all. August 1945 to December 1945. Word spread quickly among the Japanese staff. The Americans were not behaving as conquerors. They were not raping women or executing prisoners. They distributed food and medicine freely. They treated Japanese wounded with the same care they gave their own. They smiled and nodded and made awkward attempts to learn Japanese phrases. They showed photographs of their families, wives, children, parents, making themselves vulnerable and human. The cognitive dissonance rippled through the hospital like seismic waves. Every act of kindness, every gesture of respect, every moment of shared humanity chipped away at years of indoctrination. The nurses who had fled began to return, curious and cautiously hopeful. The Japanese soldiers, many of whom had been prepared to commit suicide rather than face capture, lay in their beds and watched American doctors save their lives with medicines and techniques that seemed impossibly advanced. Private Thomas Hartley became a regular fixture in the staff room. Several times a week he would sit with Kimiko and other nurses who gradually overcame their fear enough to join them. He brought paper, clean, white, abundant paper, another symbol of American plenty, and they taught him origami. Not just cranes, but frogs that could hop, flowers with layered petals, boxes with fitted lids, complex geometric forms that required dozens of precise folds. The origami sessions became a ritual, a safe space where former enemies could exist simply as people sharing a craft. Other American soldiers joined. A medic from Texas named Billy Ray learned to fold samurai helmets. A doctor from Boston with arthritis in his fingers struggled gamely with the delicate work, making the nurses laugh at his frustrated expressions. A Japanese-American interpreter named Kenji Tanaka, who had grown up in California and fought for his adopted country, sat between both groups and translated not just words but cultural contexts, explaining to the Americans what the different origami forms symbolized, teaching the Japanese nurses American songs and idioms. The paper cranes accumulated. They lined the windowsills of the staff room, perched on desks in the administrative offices, hung from strings in the patient wards. Each one represented a small victory over propaganda and fear, a tiny declaration that people could choose connection over hatred. But the transformation was not simple or complete. There were moments of tension and misunderstanding. Some Japanese staff members remained deeply suspicious, convinced that American kindness was a deceptive facade masking eventual cruelty. Some American soldiers struggled to see their former enemies as fully human, their compassion limited by lingering resentments over Pearl Harbor, Bataan. The kamikazes, Kimiko herself experienced profound inner turmoil. She had lost her younger brother at Saipan. Her uncle had died in the firebombing of Tokyo. Her childhood home was ash. The Americans had done this. These same smiling men who now sat beside her folding paper birds. How could she reconcile the men who had destroyed her country with the men who were now feeding its hungry and healing its wounded? She confessed these feelings one evening to Matron Oshiro, who had also undergone her own painful transformation. The older woman listened in silence, then spoke carefully, choosing her words with precision. "We were taught that Americans were demons," Matron Oshiro said. "But demons do not exist. Only people exist. And people are capable of both great cruelty and great kindness, sometimes within the same hour. The question is not whether Americans are good or evil. The question is, what kind of society creates men who, even after brutal war, choose to heal rather than destroy their defeated enemy?" This question haunted Kimiko. She observed the Americans more closely, trying to understand the source of their behavior. She noticed that they argued among themselves freely, that enlisted men sometimes questioned officers, that they carried newspapers from home with stories criticizing their own government. This seemed incomprehensible in a military context. Japanese soldiers who questioned authority faced severe punishment. Newspapers existed only to serve state propaganda. The abundance continued to shock her. The Americans seemed to have unlimited supplies of everything: food, medicine, clothing, machinery, even frivolous items like candy and cosmetics. They gave things away casually, without ceremony or expectation of repayment. A sergeant named Mike from Chicago noticed that Kimiko's shoes were falling apart and procured a pair of women's boots for her. New boots, sturdy leather, in her approximate size. He presented them to her with a shrug and a grin, as if providing footwear to a former enemy was the most natural thing in the world. She learned that this was called democracy, this system where people could question authority, where newspapers could criticize the government, where abundance was created through freedom and innovation rather than conquest and subjugation. The concept was difficult to grasp. Japan's entire imperial project had been built on the premise that resources were scarce and must be seized from others, that a nation's greatness came from military dominance and unquestioning obedience to authority. But here were the Americans, who had won the war not through superior obedience, but through superior productivity. They had not conquered for resources. They had resources in such abundance that they freely gave them to their defeated enemies. Their strength came not from fanatical devotion to an emperor, but from something else, something the propaganda had never explained. The creative power unleashed when people were free to think, to question, to innovate. By December, when the first snow began to fall over the ruins of Yokohama, Kimiko had filled a small wooden box with paper cranes. Some she had folded herself during quiet moments. Others had been made by American soldiers and given to her as gifts. Clumsy, imperfect cranes that she treasured more than the technically perfect ones because they represented something more valuable than aesthetic beauty. They represented the bridge between two peoples, the choice to connect rather than destroy. On Christmas Eve, the Americans organized a celebration in the hospital. They brought in a pine tree and decorated it with ornaments made from folded paper, stars and angels and snowflakes created in origami sessions by mixed groups of American soldiers and Japanese nurses working side by side. They served a feast of turkey and potatoes and pie, inviting the Japanese staff to join them. Some of the older Japanese personnel refused, unable to overcome their ingrained resistance. But many of the younger nurses, including Kimiko, accepted the invitation. Thomas Hartley found her standing beside the paper-decorated tree, looking overwhelmed by the scene. Former enemies singing songs and sharing food, laughing together in a mixture of Japanese and English and hand gestures. He approached carrying 2 cups of hot cider and offered one to her. She accepted with a bow. "Merry Christmas, Kimiko-san," he said, his Japanese pronunciation still awkward after 4 months of practice. "Merry Christmas, Thomas-san," she replied in careful English. They stood in comfortable silence, sipping the sweet, spiced cider. Around them, the celebration continued, Japanese and American voices blending, paper cranes slowly spinning on their strings in the warm air rising from the potbelly stove. Thomas reached into his pocket and withdrew a paper crane, one he had folded himself. It was still imperfect, one wing slightly larger than the other, but the craftsmanship had improved dramatically since his first attempt in August. He held it out to Kimiko. "For you," he said. "Thank you for teaching, for—" He struggled for the word in Japanese, then said in English, "for not giving up on us." Kimiko accepted the crane with trembling hands. She understood enough English to grasp his meaning. She held the small paper bird carefully, as if it were made of something more fragile than paper. Made perhaps of hope, or reconciliation, or the possibility of a different future. "Thank you," she said in English. Then, in Japanese, she added words she knew he would not fully understand, but which she needed to say. You saved more than our bodies. You saved our capacity to believe in goodness. January 1946. Thomas Hartley shipped out of Yokohama on a cold January morning. His unit was being rotated back to the United States, replaced by fresh occupation forces. He had spent 5 months in Japan, 5 months that had changed him in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. He had arrived expecting to find a defeated enemy needing to be controlled through military authority. He was leaving having discovered something unexpected, that the hard part of war was not the fighting, but the healing afterward. That victory meant nothing if it ended only in subjugation and resentment. That true strength lay not in the capacity to destroy, but in the capacity to rebuild and reconcile. On his last evening at the hospital, Kimiko and several other nurses presented him with a gift, a string of 1,000 paper cranes, the traditional senbazuru that granted wishes or healing. Each crane had been folded by different hands: Japanese nurses, American soldiers, Japanese patients, all contributing to the chain. The cranes were all colors, made from whatever paper people could find. White medical forms, pages from old magazines, scraps of newspaper, even torn pieces of uniform fabric that had been flattened and folded with determination. "We wish you safe journey," Kimiko said in English, her accent heavy, but her meaning clear. "We wish you peace. We wish you never forget." Thomas accepted the senbazuru with tears in his eyes. "I could never forget," he said. "You taught me something more important than origami. You taught me that we're not so different, you and me. We all just want to live, to love our families, to find some beauty in the world." He carried the 1,000 cranes home to Nebraska, where they would hang in his farmhouse for the rest of his life, a reminder of the Japanese nurses who had been brave enough to see past their fear and his kind enough to teach an enemy, soldier, how to fold paper into birds. DT. Transformation, the story of Japanese nurses teaching American soldiers origami in the aftermath of World War II is not widely known, but it is documented in letters, photographs, and oral histories collected by the occupation archives. These small moments of human connection played a role in Japan's remarkably successful transition from defeated enemy to democratic ally, a transformation that puzzled many observers, who expected occupation to produce resentment and resistance. Several factors contributed to this outcome. The American decision to treat defeated Japanese with relative humanity, providing food, medicine, and rebuilding assistance rather than vengeance, defied Japanese expectations shaped by propaganda. General Douglas MacArthur's administration, for all its flaws and paternalism, made strategic decisions to preserve the emperor, to frame reforms as liberation rather than imposition, and to invest heavily in Japan's economic recovery. But beneath these policy decisions were countless individual interactions between occupiers and occupied, moments when people on both sides chose connection over hatred. The origami sessions were one small example among thousands. American soldiers attending Japanese tea ceremonies, sharing baseball with local children, helping to rebuild schools and hospitals. Japanese civilians slowly, cautiously, opening themselves to the possibility that their former enemies might be something other than monsters. The paper crane became a powerful symbol of this reconciliation. In Japanese tradition, the crane represents longevity, good fortune, and peace. The practice of folding 1,000 cranes, senbazuru, was believed to grant wishes or healing. After the atomic bombings, after the surrender, after the occupation began, paper cranes began appearing everywhere as symbols of hope for a peaceful future. Sadako Sasaki, a young girl who developed leukemia from radiation exposure at Hiroshima, famously folded paper cranes during her illness in the 1950s, hoping to reach 1,000 and be granted healing. Though she died at age 12, her story and her cranes became an international symbol of peace and the devastating consequences of nuclear warfare. Today, the Children's Peace Monument in Hiroshima is adorned with thousands of paper cranes sent from around the world. The symbolism was potent, taking a flat, lifeless piece of paper and transforming it through patient, careful work into something that could fly, or appear to fly. The metaphor was almost too perfect, taking a devastated, defeated nation and transforming it through patient, careful work into something that could soar again. For the Japanese nurses who taught origami to American soldiers in 1945 and 1946, the act carried profound meaning. They were demonstrating their culture's beauty and sophistication to men they had been taught to view as barbarians. They were asserting their humanity and dignity in the face of crushing defeat. They were testing whether the conquerors would respond with respect or contempt. The Americans' response, their genuine interest, their clumsy enthusiasm, their childlike delight in creating something beautiful with their hands, provided an answer that propaganda had never prepared the Japanese nurses for. These were not demons. These were men who appreciated beauty, who respected craftsmanship, who could be taught and were eager to learn. Men who, despite having won the war, approached Japanese culture with humility rather than arrogance. For the American soldiers, the origami sessions served a different but equally important function. They provided a way to relate to their former enemies as human beings rather than abstract threats or defeated combatants. Sitting side by side, struggling with the same delicate folds, laughing together at mutual failures and celebrating small successes, these experiences made abstraction impossible. You cannot maintain hatred for someone who patiently shows you how to fold paper into a flower, who smiles with genuine pleasure when you finally get it right, who shares the universal language of creative accomplishment. The abundance of paper itself carried symbolic weight. During the war, both sides had experienced shortages of basic materials. Japanese civilians had seen resources diverted entirely to military production, leaving them with threadbare clothing, minimal food, and precious little paper for anything beyond official purposes. The Americans' casual distribution of clean, white paper, paper for art, for play, for no practical purpose beyond beauty and connection, demonstrated their resource abundance more effectively than any propaganda could have. This abundance was not accidental. It emerged from a democratic, capitalist system that incentivized innovation and productivity. Where totalitarian systems demanded obedience and sacrifice, democratic capitalism, for all its flaws and inequalities, offered individual freedom and material reward for creativity and hard work. The result was an economy that could simultaneously fight a two-front war, maintain civilian living standards, and produce enough excess to feed and rebuild its defeated enemies. Japanese intellectuals and leaders recognized this lesson. The post-war democratic reforms introduced by the occupation, land reform, women's suffrage, constitutional government, free speech, free press, were initially imposed from without. But they were embraced and internalized because they worked. They created the conditions for Japan's remarkable economic recovery and transformation into one of the world's leading democracies. The paper crane, that simple folded object taught by Japanese nurses to American soldiers, became a symbol of this larger transformation, taking something flat and limited and transforming it into something dimensional and beautiful, taking a relationship defined by violence and hatred and transforming it into one defined by mutual respect and cooperation, taking defeat and transforming it into opportunity. Spring 1952, Kimiko Hayashi stood in the rebuilt Yokohama harbor, watching ships come and go. 7 years had passed since the surrender. 7 years since she had carried a cyanide capsule in her pocket, prepared to die rather than face American conquest. Japan was a different country now, still scarred, still rebuilding, but fundamentally transformed. She worked as a public health nurse in a new clinic funded by American aid and Japanese government investment. She had married a teacher named Hiroshi and had a 2-year-old daughter named Yuki. She voted in elections, read newspapers that openly debated government policy, and lived without fear of the secret police, who had once monitored all Japanese civilians for signs of insufficient patriotic fervor. She kept Thomas Hartley's address. They exchanged letters twice a year, Christmas and summer, written in a mixture of simple English and simple Japanese, with occasional help from interpreters. He had returned to his Nebraska farm, married his childhood sweetheart, and had twin sons. He sent photographs of them all standing in front of a white farmhouse, squinting into the sun. His letters were cheerful and earnest, full of news about crops and cattle and small-town life. In every letter, he mentioned the 1,000 cranes, still hanging in his home. In every letter, Kimiko mentioned the paper crane he had given her on Christmas Eve 1945, which she kept in a small glass box on her dresser, a reminder that even enemies can become friends, that even hatred can be transformed into connection. She had taught Yuki how to fold paper cranes. The little girl's fingers were still clumsy, the folds uneven, but she persisted with the intense concentration that children bring to tasks that adults have long since mastered. Watching her daughter fold paper, Kimiko thought about Thomas Hartley's sons growing up in Nebraska and about all the children on both sides of the Pacific who would grow up never knowing the war firsthand, who would inherit a peace built on the rubble of conflict. The paper cranes her daughter folded were not perfect, but they held within them the possibility of a different world, a world where former enemies could teach each other, learn from each other, recognize their shared humanity despite all the forces that conspired to divide them. Kimiko thought about the question Matron Oshiro had posed 7 years earlier. What kind of society creates men who, even after brutal war, choose to heal rather than destroy their defeated enemy? She had come to understand that it was not that Americans were inherently better or more virtuous than Japanese. Both sides had committed atrocities. Both sides had dehumanized the other. Both sides had fought with cruelty and determination. The difference lay not in the people but in the systems they had created. A democratic society, with all its flaws and internal conflicts, had built into it mechanisms for self-correction, for dissent, for the free exchange of ideas. It empowered individuals rather than demanding their total submission to state authority. It created abundance through freedom rather than seeking abundance through conquest. The paper crane in her glass box represented this lesson. That transformation is possible, that enemies can become friends, that systems matter as much as individual virtue, that abundance shared creates lasting peace more effectively than scarcity hoarded creates temporary advantage. Epilogue. In the spring of 1945, two nations faced each other across an ocean of blood and hatred. Millions had died. Cities had been reduced to ash. Young men had been taught to kill each other without mercy or hesitation. Civilians had been taught that the enemy was subhuman, monstrous, irredeemably evil. And then, in a hospital in Yokohama, a Japanese nurse taught an American soldier how to fold a paper crane. It was a small thing, absurdly small, set against the scale of the war's destruction. But small things accumulate. Small connections multiply. Small acts of courage. The courage to teach. The courage to learn. The courage to recognize humanity in the face of someone you have been taught to hate. These small acts build the foundation for lasting peace. The paper crane does not really fly. It is paper and creases, static and earthbound. But it represents flight. It represents transformation, the ancient art of origami, of taking something flat and limited and folding it into something dimensional and beautiful. It represents the possibility that people too can be transformed, that relationships can be transformed, that nations can be transformed, that enemies can become friends, that abundance shared creates more security than scarcity hoarded, that freedom, for all its messy inefficiency, produces better outcomes than totalitarian order. That democracy, with all its arguments and conflicts and imperfections, creates societies where even defeated enemies can be treated with dignity and given the resources to rebuild. The 1,000 paper cranes that hung in Thomas Hartley's Nebraska farmhouse, each folded by different hands, Japanese and American, former enemies working together, represented this truth. The single crane that Kimiko Hayashi kept in a glass box, folded by clumsy American fingers and given as a gift, represented this truth. The countless cranes that children in Hiroshima send to the Peace Monument each year, folded in memory of Sadako Sasaki and all the war's victims, represent this truth. Peace is built through small acts of connection, through the courage to see past propaganda and fear, through the willingness to teach and to learn, through the recognition that the person on the other side, the enemy, the stranger, the one who speaks a different language and worships different gods and comes from a different culture, is still, fundamentally, a person. Someone who loves their family. Someone who wants to live without fear. Someone who can appreciate beauty. Someone who can fold paper into birds. This is what Japanese nurses taught American soldiers in 1945. This is what American soldiers taught Japanese nurses in return. This is the lesson that transformed enemies into allies, that rebuilt a shattered nation, that created a peace that has lasted not months or years, but generations. A small square of paper, a series of careful folds, a bird that does not fly, but represents the possibility of flight. Sometimes the simplest things contain the deepest truths. Sometimes the smallest acts of courage change the world.